The role of descriptions. Since the transcendent function in Sade is demonstrative and in Maslach dialectical, the role and the significance of descriptions are very different in each case. Although Sade's descriptions are basically related to the function of demonstration, they are nevertheless relatively independent creations. They are obscene in themselves. Sade cannot do without this provocative element. The same cannot be said of Maslach, for while the greatest obscenity may undoubtedly be present in threats, advertisements, or contracts, it is not a necessary condition. Indeed, the work of Maslach is on the whole commendable for its unusual decency. The most vigilant censor could hardly take exception to Venus, unless he were to question a certain atmosphere of suffocation and suspense, which is a feature of all Maslach's novels. In many of his stories, he has no difficulty in presenting masochistic fantasies as though they were instances of national custom and folklore, or the innocent games of children, or the frolics of a loving woman, or even the demands of morality and patriotism. Thus, in the excitement of a banquet, the men, following an ancient custom, drink out of the women's shoes, Sappho's slipper, young maidens ask their sweethearts to play at bears or dogs, and harness them to little carts, the Fisher of Souls. A woman in love teasingly pretends to use a document signed in blank by her lover, the blank paper. In a more serious vein, a woman patriot, in order to save her town, asks to be brought before the Turks, surrenders her husband to them as a slave, and gives herself to the Pasha, the Judith of Biapol. Undoubtedly, in all these cases, the man derives from his humiliation a secondary gain, which is specifically masochistic. Nevertheless, Maslach succeeds in presenting a great part of his work on a reassuring note and finds justification for masochistic behavior in the most varied motivations or in the demands of fateful and agonizing situations. Sade, on the other hand, could fool nobody when he tried this method. Consequently, Maslach was not a condemned author but a feted and honored one. Even the blatantly masochistic elements in his work gained acceptance as the expression of Slavonic folklore or of the spirit of Little Russia. He was known as the Turgenev of Little Russia. He could equally well have been compared to the Comtesse de Ségur. Maslach did of course produce a sober counterpart to these works, Venus, the Mother of God, the Fountain of Youth, the Hyena of the Prosta, restore the original rigor and purity of the masochistic motivation. But whether the descriptions are rosy or sober, they always bear the stamp of decency. We never see the naked body of the woman torturer. It is always wrapped in furs. The body of the victim remains in a strange state of indeterminacy, except where it receives the blows. How can we account for these two kinds of displacement in Maslach's descriptions? We are led back to the question, why does the demonstrative function of language in Sade imply obscene descriptions, while Maslach's dialectical function seems to exclude them, or at least not to treat them as essential elements? Underlying the work of Sade is negation in its broadest and deepest sense. Here we must distinguish between two levels of negation, the negative, as a partial process, and pure negation as a totalizing idea. These two levels correspond to Sade's distinction between two natures, the importance of which was shown by Klosowski. Secondary nature is bound by its own rules and its own laws. It is pervaded by the negative, but not everything in it is negation. Destruction is merely the reverse of creation and change, disorder is another form of order, and the decomposition of death is equally the composition of life. The negative is all-pervasive, but the process of death and destruction that it represents is only a partial process. Hence the disappointment of the sadistic hero, faced with a nature which seems to prove to him that the perfect crime is impossible. Yes, I abhor nature. Even the thought that other people's pain gives him pleasure does not comfort him, for this ego-satisfaction merely means that the negative can be achieved only as the reverse of positivity. Individuation, no less than the preservation of a reign or a species, are processes that testify to the narrow limits of secondary nature. In opposition to this, we find the notion of primary nature and pure negation that override all reigns and all laws, free even from the necessity to create, preserve, or individuate. Pure negation needs no foundation and is beyond all foundation, a primal delirium, an original and timeless chaos solely composed of wild and lacerating molecules. In the words of the Pope, the criminal capable of overthrowing the three realms at once by annihilating them, along with their productive capabilities, is the one who will have served nature best. But in point of fact, this original nature cannot be given. Secondary nature alone makes up the world of experience, and negation is only ever given in the partial processes of the negative. Therefore, original nature is necessarily the object of an idea, and pure negation is a delusion, but it is a delusion of reason itself. Rationalism is not grafted onto the work of Sade. It is rather by an internal necessity that he evolves the idea of a delusion, an exorbitance specific to reason. It is important to note that the distinction between the two natures corresponds to and is the foundation of the distinction between the two elements, the personal element which embodies the power of negativity and represents the way in which the sadistic ego still participates in secondary nature and reproduces its acts of violence, and the impersonal element which relates to primary nature and the delusional idea of negation, and represents the way in which the sadist negates secondary nature along with his own ego. In the 120 Days of Sodom, the libertine states that he finds excitement not in what is here, but in what is not here, the absent object, the idea of evil, the idea of that which is not, the idea of the no or of negation, which is not given and cannot be given in experience, must necessarily be the object of a demonstration, in the sense that a mathematical truth holds good even when we are asleep and even if it does not exist in nature. Hence the rage and despair of the sadistic hero when he realizes how paltry his own crimes are in relation to the idea which he can only reach through the omnipotence of reasoning. He dreams of a universal, impersonal crime, or as Clairville puts it, a crime which is perpetually effective, even when I myself cease to be effective, so that there will not be a single moment of my life, even when I am asleep, when I shall not be the cause of some disturbance. The task of the libertine is to bridge the gulf between the two elements, the element at his actual disposal and the element in his mind, the derivative and the original, the personal and the impersonal. The system expounded by Saint Fond, where Sade develops most fully the idea of a pure delirium of reason, asks under what conditions a particular pain B, produced in secondary nature, would necessarily reverberate and reproduce itself ad infinitum in primary nature. This is the clue to the meaning of repetitiveness in Sade's writing, and of the monotony of sadism. In practice, however, the libertine is confined to illustrating his total demonstration with partial inductive processes borrowed from secondary nature. He cannot do more than accelerate and condense the motions of partial violence. He achieves the acceleration by multiplying the number of his victims and their sufferings. The condensation, on the other hand, implies that violence must not be dissipated under the sway of inspiration or impulse, or even be governed by the pleasures it might afford, since those pleasures would still bind him to secondary nature, but it must be exercised in cold blood, and condensed by this very coldness, the coldness of demonstrative reason. Hence the well-known apathy of the libertine, the self-control of the pornologist, with which Sade contrasts the deplorable enthusiasm of the pornographer. Enthusiasm is precisely what he dislikes in Retief, and he could rightly say, as he always did when justifying himself publicly, that he at least had not depicted vice as pleasant or gay but as apathetic. This apathy does, of course, produce intense pleasure, but ultimately it is not the pleasure of an ego participating in secondary nature, even of a criminal ego participating in a criminal nature, but on the contrary, the pleasure of negating nature within the ego and outside the ego, and negating the ego itself. It is, in short, the pleasure of demonstrative reason. If we consider the means available to the sadist for conducting his demonstration, it appears that the demonstrative function subordinates the descriptive function, accelerates and condenses it in a controlled manner, but cannot by any means dispense with it. The descriptions must be precise both qualitatively and quantitatively, and must bear on two areas, cruel actions and disgusting actions, both of which are for the cold-blooded libertine equal sources of pleasure. In the words of the monk Clement and Justine, "You have been arrested by two irregularities you have noticed in us. You are astonished that some of our companions should be pleasantly stimulated by matters commonly held to be fetid or impure, and you are similarly surprised that our voluptuous faculties can be powerfully excited by actions which, in your view, bear none but the emblem of ferocity. In both cases, it is through the intermediary of description and the accelerating and condensing effect of repetition that the demonstrative function achieves its strongest impact. Hence it would appear that the obscenity of the descriptions in Sade is grounded in his whole conception of the negative and of negation. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud distinguishes between the life instincts and the death instincts, eros and thanatos, but in order to understand this distinction, we must make a further and more profound distinction between the death or destructive instincts and the death instinct. The former are actually given or exhibited in the unconscious, but always in combination with the life instincts. This combination of the death instincts with eros is, as it were, the precondition of the presentation of thanatos, so that destruction, and the negative work in destruction, always manifests itself as the other face of construction and unification, as governed by the pleasure principle. This is the sense in which Freud is able to state that we do not find a no, pure negation, in the unconscious, since all opposites coincide there. By contrast, when we speak of the death instinct, we refer to thanatos, the absolute negation. Thanatos as such cannot be given in psychic life, even in the unconscious. It is, as Freud pointed out in his admirable text, essentially silent, and yet we must speak of it, for it is a determinable principle, the foundation and even more of psychic life. Everything depends on it, though as Freud points out, we can only speak of it in speculative or mythical terms. The distinction between the death or destructive instincts and the death instinct seems in fact to correspond to Sade's distinction between the two natures or the two elements. The sadistic hero appears to have set himself the task of thinking out the death instinct, pure negation, in a demonstrative form, and is only able to achieve this by multiplying and condensing the activities of component negative or destructive instincts. But the question now arises whether there is not yet another method besides the speculative sadistic one. Freud has analyzed forms of resistance which in various ways imply a process of disavowal, Verneinung, Verwerfung, Verleugnung. Lacan has shown the significance of each of these terms. It might seem that a disavowal is, generally speaking, much more superficial than a negation or even a partial destruction. But this is not so, for it represents an entirely different operation. Disavowal should perhaps be understood as the point of departure of an operation that consists neither in negating nor even destroying, but rather in radically contesting the validity of that which is. It suspends belief in and neutralizes the given in such a way that a new horizon opens up beyond the given and in place of it. The clearest example given by Freud is fetishism. The fetish is the image or substitute of the female phallus, that is, the means by which we deny that the woman lacks a penis. The fetishist's choice of a fetish is determined by the last object he saw as a child before becoming aware of the missing penis. A shoe, for example, in the case of a glance directed from the feet upward. The constant return to this object, this point of departure, enables him to validate the existence of the organ that is in dispute. The fetish is therefore not a symbol at all, but as it were a frozen, arrested, two-dimensional image, a photograph to which one returns repeatedly to exercise the dangerous consequences of movement, the harmful discoveries that result from exploration. It represents the last point at which it was still possible to believe. Thus it appears that fetishism is first of all a disavowal. No, the woman does not lack a penis. Secondly, it is a defensive neutralization, since, contrary to what happens with negation, the knowledge of the situation as it is persists, but in a suspended, neutralized form. In the third place, it is a protective and idealizing neutralization, for the belief in a female phallus is itself experienced as a protest of the ideal against the real. It remains suspended or neutralized in the ideal, the better to shield itself against the painful awareness of reality. Fetishism, as defined by the process of disavowal and suspension of belief, belongs essentially to masochism. Whether it also has a place in sadism is a very complex question. There is no doubt that many sadistic murders are accompanied by rituals, as when the victim's clothes are torn without any evidence of a struggle. But it is a mistake to think of the relation of the fetishist to the fetish in terms of sadomasochistic ambivalence. It leads too easily to the creation of a sadomasochistic entity. We should not confuse, as is so often done, two very different types of violence, a potential violence toward the fetish itself, and a violence which arises only in connection with the choice and constitution of the fetish, as in hair despoiling. In our opinion, fetishism only occurs in sadism in a secondary and distorted sense. It is divested of its essential relation to disavowal and suspense, and passes into the totally different context of negativity and negation, where it becomes an agent in the sadistic process of condensation. On the other hand, there can be no masochism without fetishism in the primary sense.